For 19 minutes, Europe stopped breathing, not because of a missile launch or a troop movement, but because a single decision shattered a rule that had held for decades. Giorgia Meloni didn't announce it. She didn't brief allies or prepare a press line. She acted. And by the time Brussels realized what had happened, the damage was already done. Phones were ringing across 3 capitals, aides were whispering in hallways, and a quiet certainty began to spread among Europe's elite that something irreversible had just been set in motion. The moment came during what was supposed to be a routine coordination session. Leaders were seated, advisors lined the walls, translators murmured in glass booths. The agenda was predictable: sanctions enforcement, energy rationing, public messaging. Then Meloni pushed her chair back. No drama, no explanation. She stood, nodded once to her security detail, and left the room. Cameras didn't follow her. They didn't need to. The real action had already slipped beyond their reach. Inside a secure communications suite, shielded from recording devices and press leaks, a line was opened that had not been used in this way since the early days of the war. Moscow answered on the second ring. What followed was not a plea, not a confrontation, but something far more unsettling for Europe's leadership. A negotiation conducted without permission. Those closest to the process would later describe the tone as measured, almost clinical. No raised voices, no ideological speeches, just numbers, contingencies, and timelines. While officials in Brussels were still arguing about messaging discipline, Meloni was discussing winter demand curves and transit guarantees. She wasn't asking what Europe wanted. She was outlining what Italy needed. Back in the conference room, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stalled. Aides checked encrypted devices. One senior diplomat quietly left to make a call of his own. Word was spreading through unofficial channels faster than any formal briefing could have. Italy had crossed a line, and everyone in the room understood the implication. If Rome could do this, others could too. The first visible crack appeared on Ursula von der Leyen's face. Composure had always been her armor, but now it was slipping. She leaned toward an advisor, listened for a few seconds, then sat back without speaking. Across the table, Emmanuel Macron tapped his pen against a folder, a nervous habit that resurfaced only when plans unraveled. Olaf Scholz stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, already calculating how this would land in Berlin. The call ended before anyone could stop it. 19 minutes, no communique, no shared readout. When Meloni returned, she didn't offer an explanation. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried the message. Italy had just asserted something Brussels had spent years trying to erase: the primacy of national survival. Within half an hour, markets reacted. Energy traders didn't wait for confirmation. They never do. Futures spiked, then dipped, then spiked again as rumors collided with reality. Analysts scrambled to interpret what they couldn't see. Had Italy secured preferential volumes? Were sanctions about to fracture? Was the European front finally breaking under the weight of its own contradictions? Behind closed doors, panic replaced protocol. Emergency calls were scheduled, then rescheduled as officials realized how little leverage they actually had. There was no clause that explicitly forbade what Meloni had done, only assumptions that no one would dare to test. Those assumptions were now useless. By early evening, leaks began to surface. Carefully worded, anonymously sourced, unmistakably hostile. The narrative was clear: irresponsibility, recklessness, betrayal. Rome was accused of undermining unity, of playing into Moscow's hands, of thinking only of itself. The irony went unspoken. Every capital in Europe had quietly explored the same options. Italy was simply the first to act openly. Meloni's response was not defensive. It was deliberate. She waited until the noise reached its peak, then stepped into it. No grand speech, no lengthy justification. Just a statement grounded in necessity rather than ideology. Italy would not allow its factories to shut down or its families to freeze. It would pursue every lawful avenue available to ensure stability. Those who disagreed were free to propose alternatives. None came. Washington noticed immediately. Calls were placed. Concerns were expressed. Language was chosen with care, but the message was unmistakable. This was not what allies were supposed to do. Yet even there, frustration mingled with recognition. The same pressures squeezing Rome was squeezing everyone else. Italy had simply acknowledged reality before others were ready to admit it. As night fell, a quieter reaction began to unfold across Europe. Not outrage, but curiosity. In Prague, in Bratislava, in Budapest, officials asked the same question in private. How far could this go? If Italy had found a legal pathway through the maze of restrictions, why couldn't they? The unity Brussels defended so fiercely was starting to feel less like a principle and more like a constraint. By the time morning came, the story was no longer about a phone call. It was about permission. Permission to prioritize national interest. Permission to challenge a system that demanded sacrifice without offering solutions. Meloni hadn't just negotiated energy terms. She had shifted the psychological balance of power, and somewhere in Moscow, the silence spoke volumes. By the second day, the official narrative was already collapsing under its own weight. Brussels insisted nothing had changed, that European policy remained unified and intact. But inside government buildings across the continent, the mood told a different story. Advisors were no longer asking whether Italy had gone too far. They were asking how it had managed to do what everyone else had been afraid to attempt. The legal foundation emerged quietly, almost accidentally. Buried deep within treaty language designed for emergencies, there was space for maneuver. Italy's lawyers had spent months dissecting it, line by line, anticipating every possible objection. What they built was not a violation, but a shield. An argument so technically sound that challenging it would expose how fragile Europe's energy framework had always been. Brussels understood this immediately. That was why the response grew harsher in tone, but weaker in substance. Publicly, the attacks intensified. Headlines questioned Meloni's loyalty. Commentators speculated about secret concessions. None of it landed. The accusations lacked proof, and more importantly, they lacked resonance. With a public facing soaring bills and uncertain winters, in Italy approval numbers rose. Across Europe, something more dangerous happened for the establishment understanding. Markets confirmed what politicians would not say out loud. Italian firms gained ground, buoyed by the possibility of predictability in a chaotic energy landscape. Elsewhere, stocks wavered. Investors were not punishing Italy, they were rewarding decisiveness. The message was brutal in its simplicity. Stability mattered more than slogans. At an emergency European Council meeting, tension hung thick in the air. Demands for transparency were met with procedural calm. Italy acknowledged the call, confirmed discussions, and declined to elaborate. Every word was chosen to offer nothing without conceding anything. The room sensed the shift. Authority was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. And Brussels was coming up short. What unsettled officials most was not Rome's defiance, but the echoes it created. Documents surfaced suggesting informal contacts between other member states and Moscow, contacts that had existed for months without consequence. Italy hadn't broken unity. It had exposed a fiction. The moral outrage that followed was not about principle, but about being seen. NATO weighed in cautiously, careful not to ignite a larger fracture. The alliance had survived worse, but this was different. This wasn't a security breach. It was a confidence breach. When economic survival clashed with collective posture, the latter began to look negotiable. That realization could not be reversed. In Berlin, the conversation shifted behind closed doors. Industry leaders pressed their case. If Italy could secure relief without formal sanctions violations, why should German factories shoulder disproportionate pain? The government's public restraint masked an internal reckoning. The Italian move was no longer an anomaly. It was a precedent. Meloni remained conspicuously untroubled. She did not tour studios or court foreign approval. She let the consequences speak. Each day that passed without retaliation strengthened her position. Each hesitant statement from Brussels reinforced the impression that control had slipped. The deeper impact became visible only later. Europe's grand narrative of unity had relied on mutual restraint. No one acted because everyone believed no one else would. That illusion was gone. What replaced it was quieter, more dangerous. Choice! Moscow, for its part, said nothing. There was no triumphalism, no press release, none was needed. The objective had been achieved without spectacle. Europe was negotiating with itself now, divided not by ideology, but by necessity. The phone call had simply revealed the fault lines. As winter planning accelerated, One truth settled in. The old rules still existed on paper, but their authority had eroded. Meloni had not dismantled European unity in a single move. She had shown that it could be bypassed. That knowledge would linger far longer than any agreement. History would debate whether this moment marked the beginning of fragmentation or the start of a more honest Europe. But for those watching closely, the significance was already clear. Power had shifted not through force, but through resolve. One call, 19 minutes, and a continent forced to confront what it was willing to endure and what it was not. The board had changed. The next moves would not be made in Brussels alone.